Stop relying on us, my daughter-in-law said at the table, and what unsettled me most wasn't the words. It was that no one reacted, not even my own son. I remember the exact way she said it, her voice light, almost amused, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of speaking to a woman who had spent 40 years building the very family she now sat across from. I didn't answer right away. I simply looked down at my plate, at the neatly arranged slices of roast chicken I had helped prepare just an hour earlier, and for a moment, I wondered if I had misheard her. But I hadn't, because the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was acceptance. Thank you for being here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because I have a feeling this story will travel farther than I ever expected. That Sunday lunch was supposed to be simple. Just the three of us, my son Daniel, my daughter-in-law Ashley, and me, gathered around the same oak table that had once been the center of every holiday, every birthday, every small victory we'd ever celebrated. I had arrived early, as I always did, carrying a homemade apple pie wrapped carefully in foil, still warm from my oven. Ashley had barely glanced at it when I set it on the counter. "We already have dessert," she said, her tone polite but distant, like she was speaking to a neighbor she didn't particularly like. I smiled anyway. I always smiled. At 68, I had learned that sometimes maintaining peace required swallowing small disappointments. But something about that day felt off. It wasn't just the way Ashley avoided eye contact or how Daniel seemed unusually quiet, his attention fixed on his phone more than on the conversation. It was the feeling that I had walked into a room where something had already been decided without me. We sat down to eat, and for a while, everything appeared normal. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of the television in the background, Ashley talking about a friend's new house renovation, her voice animated, confident. I nodded in the right places, asked polite questions, tried to be part of the conversation. But I noticed something. Every time I spoke, even just to add a small comment, Ashley would respond with a tight smile, then redirect the conversation back to herself. And Daniel, he let her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at me. It was subtle, almost invisible. But I felt it, like a draft in a closed room. Then came the moment I can't forget. Ashley leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms lightly, her eyes flicking toward me with a kind of casual sharpness. "You know," she said, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "At some point, you really should stop relying on us." The words landed softly, but they cut deep. I blinked, unsure how to respond. "Relying on you?" I repeated, my voice calm, though I could feel something tightening in my chest. Ashley shrugged, as if it were obvious. "Well, yeah. I mean, we've got our own life to think about. Bills, plans, the future. We can't always be your safety net." I stared at her for a second longer than I intended. Because the truth was, I didn't rely on them. Not for money. Not for housing. Not for anything. I had my own home, fully paid off. My own savings. My own routine. If anything, I had always been the one offering help, watching their house when they traveled, bringing meals when Ashley said she was too busy to cook, quietly covering little expenses they brushed off as temporary. I turned to Daniel then, expecting, hoping, for him to say something, to correct her, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding. But he didn't. He kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his food into small, careful pieces as if it required all his concentration. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, almost imperceptible change, like a crack forming beneath the surface of still water. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded once and said, "I see." The rest of the meal passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. Ashley moved on as if nothing had happened, discussing weekend plans and shopping lists. Daniel chimed in occasionally, his voice steady, normal, and I sat there, listening, observing, feeling like a guest in a life I had once built with my own hands. When lunch ended, I gathered my things quietly. Ashley thanked me for coming in that same distant tone, already distracted, already thinking about something else. Daniel walked me to the door, but even then, he didn't meet my eyes. "Drive safe, Mom," he said. Just that. Nothing more. The drive home was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, replaying that sentence over and over in my mind. Stop relying on us. The words didn't match my reality, and that was what bothered me most. Because if it wasn't true, then why did she say it? And why did my son let her? When I got home, I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, staring at the quiet space around me. Everything was exactly as I had left it that morning. Clean. Organized. Mine. I walked slowly into the living room, lowering myself into my favorite chair, the one by the window where the afternoon light always fell just right. And that's when the question finally surfaced, clear and undeniable. What if this wasn't just a careless remark? What if it was something else entirely? Something planned. Something built quietly over time, just out of my sight. I sat there for a long time, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, feeling that same subtle unease settle deeper into my chest. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering why Ashley had said those words. I was wondering what she believed I didn't know. I have never been the kind of woman who depends on others, and that is what kept echoing in my mind as the afternoon stretched into evening, each hour passing with a quiet heaviness that settled into my home like dust that no one notices until it begins to cover everything. I moved through my usual routine that day with the same care I always had, rinsing the dishes I had left in the sink that morning, folding the blanket draped over the back of my sofa, adjusting the small framed photographs that lined the shelf near the window, each one holding a piece of a life I had built long before Ashley ever walked into it. There was one photo of Daniel as a boy, no older than 10, standing proudly beside the old bicycle I had saved for months to buy him, his smile wide and unguarded, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist as if I were the center of his world. I paused there longer than I intended, my fingers brushing lightly against the glass, remembering how he used to look at me back then, with trust, with warmth, with something that did not need to be questioned. It is strange how time does not erase memories, but rearranges their meaning. I made myself a cup of tea around 6 in the evening, the same brand I had been drinking for years, placing the kettle back carefully, listening to the familiar click as it settled into place. There is comfort in routine, in the small, predictable things that remind you that not everything changes without your permission. But that comfort did not last long, because no matter how many times I replayed the afternoon in my mind, one detail refused to settle into place. Relying on them. It was not just the words. It was the certainty behind them. Ashley had not sounded defensive or frustrated. She had sounded assured, as if she were stating a fact that had already been agreed upon somewhere beyond my awareness. And that was what began to trouble me more than anything else. Because people do not speak with that kind of confidence unless they believe they are right, or unless they believe the truth is already on their side. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same place where I had balanced budgets for decades, where I had planned school expenses, medical bills, and every unexpected cost that came with raising a child on my own after my husband passed. I have always been careful with money, careful with decisions, careful with trust. It was not fear that guided me. It was responsibility. That is why nothing about Ashley's statement made sense. I reached for my notebook, the one I still kept out of habit even though most things had gone digital years ago, and flipped through the pages filled with neat, deliberate handwriting, small records of monthly expenses, property taxes, insurance payments, donations, and the occasional gift I had given to Daniel and Ashley without ever expecting anything in return. Everything was there. Clear. Accounted for. There was no pattern of dependency, no hidden reliance, no unexplained gaps. And yet, the feeling remained. It was subtle, like a thread you cannot see but can feel when it brushes against your skin. I stood up slowly and walked toward the small desk in the corner of my living room where my laptop rested. I had not planned to check anything that night. In fact, I had told myself that I was overthinking, that perhaps Ashley's words had been careless, poorly chosen, nothing more. But something inside me would not let it go. It was not panic. It was not even anger. It was a quiet insistence that I had learned to trust over the years, the same instinct that had once told me when something was wrong with Daniel even before he spoke a word as a child. I opened the laptop and waited as it powered on, the screen casting a soft light across the room as the sun dipped lower outside. For a moment, I hesitated, because there is a certain kind of peace that exists in not knowing, in choosing to believe that everything is exactly as it appears. But there is also a cost to that peace. And I had paid that cost before in smaller ways, in overlooked details, in assumptions that turned out to be mistakes. I was not willing to do that again. I logged into my bank account, my fingers moving steadily across the keyboard, each keystroke deliberate, controlled. The familiar dashboard appeared, the numbers exactly where they should be, clean and organized, nothing immediately out of place. I let out a small breath, almost relieved, almost ready to close the laptop and dismiss the entire afternoon as nothing more than an uncomfortable misunderstanding. But then I remembered the tone in Ashley's voice. Not irritated, not defensive, certain. I clicked on the transaction history. At first, everything looked normal. Utility payments, grocery expenses, insurance withdrawals, the same pattern I had seen for years. But then, as I scrolled further down, something small caught my attention. It was not a large amount. In fact, it was so small that most people would not have noticed it at all. A transfer, then another, and another, spread out over time, quiet, consistent, almost careful. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing slightly as I read through the details again. The dates were regular, the amounts similar, never enough to raise immediate concern, but enough to form a pattern once you knew where to look. My heart did not race. I did not gasp. I simply sat there, very still, letting the information settle into place piece by piece, like a puzzle that had been waiting patiently to be assembled. Because in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. This was not new. This had been happening for a while. And the reason I had not noticed was not because it was hidden well. It was because I had never thought to look. I scrolled further, tracing the history back month after month, each entry confirming what the last one had suggested. The same destination, the same quiet movement of money that I had never authorized, never questioned, never even considered. I rested my hands on the table, folding them together as I stared at the screen, the soft glow reflecting in the glass of the window beside me. Outside, the neighborhood remained calm, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all. But inside, something had. Not a burst of emotion, not a dramatic realization, just a slow, steady clarity that settled into my mind with undeniable precision. Ashley's words were not an insult. They were a cover. And for the first time that day, I was no longer asking why she had said them. I was beginning to understand what she was trying to protect. I did not close the laptop right away, even after I had seen enough to understand that something was wrong. Because there is a difference between noticing a problem and fully allowing yourself to accept what it means, and I was not ready to move too quickly past that line. I scrolled back to the top of the transaction list again, slower this time, reading each entry with more attention, not just looking at the amounts but at the descriptions, the timing, the subtle repetition that had once blended into the background of my routine. The transfers were labeled in a way that seemed almost ordinary, coded just enough to avoid drawing attention, but consistent enough that once you recognized the pattern, it became impossible to ignore. I reached for my glasses, adjusting them slightly as I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the details with a steady gaze. The receiving account was partially masked, but the last 4 digits appeared again and again, like a quiet signature left behind without concern. I did not recognize it at first, and that, more than anything, unsettled me, because I have always known exactly where my money goes. Every account, every payment, every withdrawal. That is how I survived the years after my husband passed, how I kept our home, how I made sure Daniel never felt the weight of what we had lost. There was never room for uncertainty. And yet here it was, sitting plainly in front of me, repeating itself over months, perhaps longer. I opened another tab and accessed a different part of my records, the section that listed linked accounts and authorized users. It took only a few seconds for the page to load, but in that short space of time, I felt something shift again inside me. Not fear, not panic, but a quiet preparation, as if some part of me already knew what I was about to find. The list appeared. My primary account, my savings, a smaller account I had set aside years ago for emergencies. All familiar, all expected. But then there was one more. A secondary account I did not remember opening. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind moving carefully through possibilities, trying to find a reasonable explanation, something I had forgotten, something I had overlooked. But nothing came, because I would not forget something like that. Not an account, not something tied so directly to my financial identity. I clicked on it. The page opened slowly, revealing a balance that was not insignificant, built gradually over time through the same small transfers I had just seen. It was not enough to cause immediate alarm if viewed in isolation, but together, it formed something much more deliberate. My eyes moved to the account details, and there it was, a name listed beneath mine. Joint account holder, Ashley Collins. I did not react, not outwardly. I simply sat there, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, my breathing steady, my thoughts aligning one by one, into a clarity that felt almost too precise to be accidental. I read the name again, just to be certain. There was no mistake, no confusion. Her name was there, attached to something I had never agreed to, something I had never knowingly created. I leaned back slightly in my chair, the wood creaking softly beneath me, the quiet of the room pressing in as the weight of what I was seeing settled fully into place. It was not just the transfers. It was the structure behind them, the intention. This was not a single mistake or an isolated incident. This was a system, carefully arranged, quietly maintained. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to escape what I had found, but to allow my mind to move through it without interruption. And as I did, pieces of the past began to shift, small moments that had once seemed harmless now taking on a different shape. I remembered a conversation from nearly a year ago, when Ashley had offered to help me organize my accounts after I mentioned how much I disliked the newer online systems. She had sat beside me at this same table, her voice patient, reassuring, guiding me through forms and settings, asking me to confirm details, to sign digitally where needed. At the time, I had been grateful. It had felt like support, like care. Now, it felt like something else entirely. I opened my eyes and looked back at the screen, letting that memory settle into the present. There had been other moments too. Times when Daniel had casually asked about my finances, about how I was managing, whether I had considered consolidating accounts, whether everything was set up properly. I had answered without hesitation, without suspicion, because that is what trust looks like when it has never been broken, or when you believe it has not. I moved the cursor slowly across the screen, opening a few more details, confirming what I already knew but needed to see in full. Dates aligned. Access permissions confirmed. Notifications that had likely been redirected or overlooked. It was all there, not hidden, but arranged in such a way that only someone looking closely would notice. And I had not been looking. Not until today. Not until that sentence at the table forced something open that had been quietly building beneath the surface for longer than I realized. I stood up then, walking slowly to the window, my reflection faint against the glass as the last of the daylight faded outside. The neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, steady and predictable, unchanged by what I had just uncovered. I folded my arms lightly, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, a small gesture that grounded me in moments when I needed to think clearly. Because that was the most important thing now. Not reacting, not confronting, thinking. Ashley had not been careless. She had been confident. And confidence like that does not come from nowhere. It comes from believing that the person you are dealing with will not question you, will not look too closely, will continue to trust even when trust is no longer deserved. I turned back toward the table, my gaze settling once more on the open laptop, the quiet evidence waiting patiently where I had left it. For years, I had built my life on consistency, on discipline, on understanding every detail that affected my future. I had not lost that ability. I had simply allowed it to rest in the presence of people I believed were safe. That assumption had just changed. And as I stood there, looking at the screen, I realized something with a calm certainty that left no room for doubt. This was not where the story ended. This was where it finally began to make sense. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind had begun to move in a way it had not in years, carefully, methodically, as if it had been waiting for a reason to wake up again, and now that it had one, it refused to slow down. I left the laptop open on the table long after midnight, the screen dimming and brightening as I moved through different pages, not searching randomly, but following a quiet line of logic that had already begun to take shape in my thoughts. Every transaction, every authorization, every small detail I had once trusted without question now felt like a thread leading back to something larger, something that had been constructed with more intention than I had given it credit for. I returned to the transaction list again, this time writing down the dates and amounts in my notebook, the same steady handwriting I had used for decades, each number placed carefully on the page as if the act of writing would anchor the truth more firmly in reality. There was a pattern, not just in the timing, but in the intervals between each transfer, spaced in a way that suggested planning, not coincidence. It was not rushed. It was not careless. It was patient. That realization stayed with me as I turned the page and continued, mapping out months of activity that I had never questioned because I had never been given a reason to. Until now. Around 2 in the morning, I stood up and walked into the hallway, the house quiet, the air still, everything exactly as it had been for years, and yet it felt different, not unfamiliar, but newly revealed, as if I were seeing it from a distance instead of living inside it. I paused outside the small room that had once been Daniel's, the door slightly open, the same way I had left it after cleaning it last spring. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, taking in the simple details that had not changed, the bookshelf, the desk, the faint outline of where posters had once been taped to the walls. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the years when this house had been filled with a different kind of certainty, when every decision I made had been centered around raising a child who would one day build a life of his own. I had never expected anything in return. That was not how I saw motherhood. But I had expected honesty. I had expected respect. And now, standing there in that quiet room, I began to understand that what had been taken from me was not just money. It was the assumption that I had been included in the truth of my own life. I returned to the kitchen slowly, the floor cool beneath my feet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. The laptop was still there, waiting, unchanged, holding everything exactly as I had left it. I sat down again and opened a different section of the account settings, one I rarely used, the area that tracked login activity and device access. It took a moment to load, but when it did, the information was clear. Multiple devices, multiple locations, not all of them mine. I studied the entries carefully, noting the times, the frequency, the consistency. There were logins during hours when I was asleep, times when I had not touched the computer, moments that aligned too closely with visits, with conversations, with instances when Ashley had been present, offering help, asking questions, guiding me through processes I had assumed were routine. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, something steadier. Clarity. Because the more I looked, the less room there was for doubt. This had not been an accident. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been a decision, repeated over time, maintained with care, protected by my own trust. I reached for my phone then, not to call anyone, not to confront, but to open my calendar. I scrolled back through the past year, aligning dates with what I had just written down, matching visits with activity, conversations with transactions, small details that had once seemed unrelated now fitting together with a precision that was almost unsettling in its simplicity. There was the afternoon Ashley had spent here, sitting beside me at the table, guiding me through what she called an update to my account settings. There was the weekend Daniel had insisted on helping me organize paperwork, suggesting we move things online to make it easier. There were moments I had appreciated at the time, moments that had felt like support, like family working together. Now they felt like something else entirely. I set the phone down and looked at my reflection in the darkened screen for a brief second before the page refreshed, replacing it with numbers and data once more. I looked calm. That surprised me, but it also made sense. Because this was not the first time life had required me to adapt quickly, to understand something difficult without allowing it to break my ability to respond. I had done it before, in different ways, under different circumstances. This was no different, just quieter. I closed the laptop gently, not out of hesitation, but because I had seen enough for now. The information was not going anywhere. It would still be there in the morning, exactly as it was now. What mattered was what I did next. I stood up, turning off the kitchen light, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway as I made my way toward my bedroom. The house settled around me again, familiar, steady, unchanged on the surface. But something fundamental had shifted beneath it. Not in the walls, not in the rooms, but in the way I understood the people who had once moved freely through them. As I lay down, staring at the ceiling in the quiet darkness, one thought remained clear, steady, impossible to ignore. They believed I would never look closely enough to see it. And for a long time, they were right. But that time was over. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had rested well, but because my mind had already moved ahead of my body, continuing the quiet work it had started the night before, organizing details, connecting pieces, refining a picture that was no longer vague or uncertain. The house felt the same as it always did in the early hours, still and composed, the soft light of morning stretching slowly across the kitchen floor as I stepped in and reached for the coffee maker. I followed my routine without interruption, measuring the grounds, filling the water, pressing the button, listening to the familiar sound as it began to brew. There is a certain steadiness in repetition, a sense that even when something shifts beneath the surface, the structure of daily life remains intact, at least for a while. I poured myself a cup and sat down at the table, the same table where everything had begun to unravel just hours earlier, and opened my notebook again. The numbers I had written during the night were still there, precise and deliberate, forming a quiet record of something that had once gone unnoticed. I traced a finger lightly along the lines, not to double-check them, but to ground myself in the reality they represented. Because what I had seen was not speculation. It was fact, and facts require response, not emotion. I took a slow sip of coffee and reached for my phone, opening my contacts, and scrolling to a name I had not needed to call in a long time. Susan Parker. We had met years ago through a community legal seminar, and over time, she had become someone I trusted when it came to matters that required both discretion and clarity. I hesitated only briefly before pressing the call button, holding the phone to my ear as it rang. She answered on the third ring, her voice calm, familiar. I did not explain everything at once. I simply asked if she had time to meet later that day, mentioning that I needed advice on something related to my accounts. She did not ask many questions. She never did. "Come by at 10, she said, her tone steady. "Bring whatever you have." I thanked her and ended the call, setting the phone down carefully beside my notebook. There was no urgency in my movements. No rush. Because this was not something that would be resolved in a single conversation. This was something that had been built over time, and it would require the same patience to dismantle. I spent the next hour gathering documents, not in a frantic way, but with the same methodical care I had always applied to important matters. Bank statements, printed transaction histories, notes I had made during the night, each item placed neatly into a folder. I also included a copy of my identification and any paperwork I could find related to my accounts, even those I believed were no longer relevant. Details matter. They always have. Before leaving the house, I paused in the hallway, glancing briefly toward the living room where my laptop still rested on the table. For a moment, I considered bringing it with me, but decided against it. What I needed was already documented. The rest could wait. I picked up my keys and stepped outside, locking the door behind me with the same quiet click I had heard thousands of times before, a sound that once meant routine and now carried a slightly different weight, not heavier, just more aware. The drive to Susan's office took about 20 minutes, the roads familiar, the traffic light, everything moving as it always did, as if the world had no reason to adjust for the shift that had taken place in my understanding. I parked in the small lot behind her building and sat for a moment before getting out, looking straight ahead, letting the silence settle one more time before stepping into a space where things would begin to take a more defined shape. Her office was exactly as I remembered it, neat, organized, the kind of place where nothing felt rushed or overlooked. She greeted me with a brief smile and motioned for me to sit. I placed the folder on her desk and opened it slowly, sliding the documents toward her one by one. She did not interrupt as she reviewed them. She read carefully, her eyes moving across the pages with practiced attention, occasionally pausing to compare dates or trace a line of numbers. I watched her, not searching for a reaction, but noting the way her expression remained neutral, focused, controlled. After several minutes, she set the papers down and looked at me. "You did not authorize this?" she asked. "No," I said, my voice steady. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already begun to suspect. "And this joint account," she continued, tapping lightly on one of the pages, "you were not aware of it being opened?" "No," I repeated. She leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her hands together for a moment before speaking again. "Then what you are looking at is not just questionable," she said. "It is actionable." The words settled into the space between us with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Actionable. Not emotional. Not personal. Defined. Structured. Real. I felt no surge of anger, no sudden shift in my breathing. just a quiet alignment of everything I had already begun to understand. What are my options? I asked. Susan's expression remained steady. First, she said, we secure your accounts. Immediately. Then we document everything. Every transaction. Every access point. After that, we decide how you want to proceed. She paused briefly, her gaze meeting mine with a level of directness I appreciated. Because from what I see here, this is not something that happened by accident. I nodded once, not because I needed confirmation, but because I had already reached that conclusion on my own. The difference now was that it was no longer just my understanding. It was something that could be addressed, structured, proven. I gathered the documents back into the folder slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, each paper returning to its place as part of a process that had only just begun. And as I stood to leave, one thought remained clear, steady, and entirely free of doubt. This was no longer about what they had done. It was about what I would do next. I did not go home right away after leaving Susan's office, not because I was unsure of what to do, but because I understood that the next steps required a different kind of presence, one that was not clouded by familiarity or routine. And so I sat in my car for a few minutes, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, letting the quiet settle again as I reviewed everything she had said. Secure the accounts. Document everything. Decide how to proceed. The words were simple, but they carried a structure I recognized, the kind that turns uncertainty into action. I started the engine and drove, not back to my house, but to the nearest branch of my bank, a place I had visited many times over the years, always for ordinary reasons, always with the assumption that everything inside those walls reflected order and trust. Today, it felt different, not unfamiliar, but newly significant, as if I were stepping into a space where something needed to be corrected rather than maintained. Inside, the air was cool, the lighting steady, the quiet murmur of conversations blending into the background. I approached the front desk and asked to speak with a manager, keeping my voice calm, my expression composed. There was no need for urgency in my tone. What I carried with me was already enough. I was guided to a small office near the back, where a man in his 40s greeted me with a polite nod and introduced himself as Michael. I sat across from him and placed my folder on the desk, opening it with the same care I had shown earlier that morning. I need to review access and activity on my accounts, I said, my voice steady, direct. He nodded and began the process, asking for identification, verifying details, following protocol step by step. I answered each question clearly, without hesitation, watching as he navigated through the system on his screen. When I mentioned the secondary account, the one I had not known existed, his expression shifted slightly, not alarmed, but more focused. He pulled up the account information and turned the screen slightly, so I could see. There it was again, my name, and beneath it, Ashley's. He paused for a moment before speaking. This is listed as a joint account, he said. It appears both parties have full access. I understand what it says, I replied. What I am telling you is that I did not authorize it. He looked at me then, more carefully, as if reassessing the situation with a different lens. Do you recall signing any documents that might have included this account? He asked. I held his gaze steadily. No, I said, but I do recall being assisted with online updates by someone who had access to my information at the time. He nodded slowly, his fingers moving across the keyboard as he opened additional records. We can place an immediate restriction on the account, he said, and we can begin a formal review of the activity. Do that, I said, without raising my voice, without adding anything unnecessary. He continued working, explaining each step as he went, freezing transactions, flagging the account, initiating a review process that would require documentation and follow-up. I listened, not because I needed to understand every detail, but because I wanted to confirm that each action was being taken, that the structure was shifting in a way that no longer allowed quiet movement without oversight. When he finished, he printed a summary and handed it to me, outlining the restrictions now in place and the next steps in the review. I accepted the paper and placed it neatly back into my folder alongside everything else. Is there anything else you would like to address today? He asked. I considered the question for a moment, not because I lacked an answer, but because I was measuring what needed to be done now and what could wait. Yes, I said finally. I would like to update all access permissions on my primary accounts. Remove any secondary access. Require direct authorization for any changes. He nodded again, returning to the system, making adjustments that I had not thought necessary before, but now understood were essential. It took another 20 minutes to complete everything, each step reinforcing the same quiet shift that had begun the night before. When I stood to leave, there was no sense of relief, no immediate change in how I felt, just a steady awareness that something important had been secured. Outside, the day had fully settled into its rhythm, cars passing, people moving through their routines, everything continuing as it always does. I walked to my car and sat down, placing the folder on the seat beside me, my hand resting on it for a brief moment before starting the engine. The drive home was uneventful, the same roads, the same turns, nothing outwardly different. But as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the ignition, I realized that the silence I felt was no longer uncertain. It was controlled. I stepped inside the house and closed the door behind me, the familiar click marking the boundary between what had been and what was now beginning to take shape. I placed the folder back on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment, looking at it, understanding that everything inside represented more than just records. It was proof, structure, a foundation for whatever came next. I did not reach for the laptop this time. I did not need to. The information was already moving forward, no longer contained within my own awareness. And as I moved through the house, returning to the quiet rhythm of my day, one thought remained steady, not loud, not emotional, just clear. They had relied on my silence. They had relied on my trust. But now, for the first time, they would have to rely on something else entirely. And I was not sure they were prepared for that. I did not call Daniel that day, and I did not send a message, because there are moments when silence carries more weight than words, especially when the truth is already in motion and does not need to be announced. Instead, I continued as I normally would, moving through the afternoon with a steady pace, allowing the routine to remain intact on the surface while everything beneath it had already shifted into something far more deliberate. I prepared a simple dinner, something light, more out of habit than hunger, and ate at the same table where the folder now rested, closed, organized, waiting. Every now and then, my eyes would move toward it, not with hesitation, but with awareness, like looking at a map you already understand but still respect for the direction it provides. Around 6 in the evening, my phone lit up on the counter. Daniel. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it ring once, twice, before picking it up, my voice calm when I answered. Hello. There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had not expected that tone. Hey, Mom, he said, his voice careful, almost measured. Just wanted to check in. You got home okay yesterday? I leaned slightly against the counter, my fingers resting lightly against the surface. I did, I replied. Everything is fine. Another pause. Subtle, but there. Good, he said. Ashley was just saying, you seemed a little quiet at lunch. I allowed a small breath to pass, not as a reaction, but as a moment to consider how much to say. I was listening, I said simply. Sometimes that is enough. He let out a short, uncertain laugh, the kind people use when they are not sure how to respond. Yeah, he said. I guess so. The conversation could have ended there, but it did not. Because beneath his tone, there was something else, something that had not been there before. A kind of cautiousness, as if he were trying to gauge something without asking directly. Listen, he continued. Ashley did not mean anything by what she said. You know how she is. She just speaks her mind. I did not interrupt him. I let him finish, let the explanation settle into the space between us. I understand, I said, my voice even controlled. People usually do. There was a shift then, subtle but clear. What does that mean? He asked. I looked down at the counter for a moment, tracing the edge with my finger, not because I needed time to think, but because I was choosing my words with care. It means, I said slowly, that when someone speaks with that kind of certainty, it usually comes from something they believe to be true. Silence followed. Not long, but long enough to be noticed. Well, he said finally, she just thinks you should not have to worry about things, that is all. That is why we help. I let that sentence settle, not challenging it directly, not correcting it, just allowing it to exist exactly as he presented it. I see, I said. That is kind of you. My tone did not change, and I could hear the effect of that more clearly than any words I might have chosen. Because calm does something that emotion cannot. It removes the expectation of reaction. It leaves space. And in that space, people begin to reveal more than they intend. We just want to make sure everything is taken care of, he added, his voice softer now, more careful than before. Of course, I replied. That is important. Another pause. Longer this time. Mom, he said, is everything okay? I smiled slightly, though he could not see it. Not out of amusement, but out of recognition. Because the question was not about my well-being. It was about control, about certainty, about whether the ground beneath them was still as stable as they believed it to be. Everything is exactly as it should be, I said. And for the first time in the conversation, that statement was entirely true. I heard him exhale quietly, a sound that carried more than relief, more like recalibration. Okay, he said. That is good. We ended the call shortly after. Nothing dramatic, no confrontation, just a normal goodbye that would have meant nothing if not for everything that now stood behind it. I set the phone down and remained where I was for a moment, the quiet of the house returning as if nothing had interrupted it. But something had, not in what was said, but in what was not. Because Daniel had called to check something, to confirm something. And whatever answer he had been expecting, it was not the one I gave. I walked back to the table and opened the folder again, not to review the documents, but to remind myself of what was real, what was verified, what no longer depended on assumption or trust. The papers remained unchanged, the numbers steady, the structure intact. Outside, the evening settled into its usual rhythm, the sky dimming, the neighborhood lights turning on one by one. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. And yet, beneath that familiar surface, something had already begun to shift in a way that could not be undone. I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on top of it for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of what it represented. This was no longer a question, no longer a suspicion. It was a position. And positions, once established, do not disappear simply because someone wishes them to. As I turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the hallway, one thought remained steady in my mind, clear and controlled. They were beginning to sense it now. Not the details, not the evidence, but the change. And that was exactly where I wanted them to be. The next morning arrived without disruption, the same pale light filtering through the curtains, the same quiet settling over the house. But there was a difference in the way I moved through it, not in what I did, but in how deliberately I did it. Each action measured, each decision placed carefully within a plan that no longer needed to be rushed. I did not check my accounts immediately. I did not open the folder. Instead, I made breakfast, something simple, toast and eggs, and ate slowly at the table, allowing the stillness to remain intact. There is a kind of strength in not reacting too quickly, in allowing events to unfold while you hold your position without announcing it. After finishing, I cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and only then did I sit down and open the folder again, reviewing the documents not because I doubted them, but because repetition builds clarity, and clarity builds control. Around 9 in the morning, my phone vibrated softly against the table. This time, it was not Daniel. It was Ashley. I looked at the name for a moment before answering, noting the timing, the fact that she had not called the day before, the sequence in which they were now reaching out. I picked up the phone, my voice steady. Good morning. Hi, she said, her tone bright, almost overly so, as if she were stepping into a conversation that required a certain kind of performance. I just wanted to check in. Daniel said you sounded a little distant last night. I allowed a brief pause, not long enough to feel intentional, just enough to let the words settle. I sounded like myself, I replied. There was a slight shift on the other end, subtle but noticeable. Of course, she said quickly. I just mean, after Sunday, I wanted to make sure there were no hard feelings. You know I did not mean anything by what I said. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. You were very clear, I said. And I appreciate clarity. Silence followed, just for a second, but it carried more weight than any explanation she might have offered. Right? She said, her tone adjusting, becoming more careful. Well, we just want what is best for you. We have been helping where we can, and sometimes it feels like maybe you do not realize how much we have taken on. I let her finish, not interrupting, not correcting, simply listening as she built her version of the narrative. That is interesting, I said calmly, because I spent some time yesterday reviewing my accounts. There it was. Not a confrontation. Not an accusation. Just a statement. Simple. Direct. True. The silence that followed was different this time. Not casual. Not uncertain. Measured. "Oh," she said after a moment. And I could hear the shift now, the careful placement of each word, the attempt to maintain control of a situation that was beginning to move beyond it. "And I found a few things I had not noticed before," I replied. My tone did not change. It did not need to. "Things I would like to understand better." Another pause. Slightly longer. "Well," she said, a small edge entering her voice, "that is probably just the way everything is set up. You know how complicated those systems can be. That is why I helped you with it." I allowed myself a small breath, not of frustration, but of recognition. "Yes," I said. "I remember." I stood up then and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same view I had seen for years, unchanged, steady. "Which is why I thought it would be helpful to have everything reviewed properly," I continued, "by someone who deals with these things every day." There was no need to mention Susan by name. The implication was enough. "Reviewed?" Ashley repeated, her voice tightening just slightly. "What do you mean reviewed?" I rested my hand lightly against the window frame, my reflection faint in the glass. "Exactly what it sounds like," I said. "A full review. Access, transactions, account structures. Just to make sure everything is exactly as it should be." This time, the silence was unmistakable. Not confusion. Not hesitation. Calculation. I could almost hear the shift in her thoughts, the quick reassessment, the realization that something had moved beyond the boundaries she had expected. "I mean," she said slowly, "that seems a little unnecessary. We have already been handling things, and everything has been fine." I turned slightly, my gaze moving back toward the table where the folder rested, closed, complete. "That depends on how you define fine," I said. My voice remained calm, even, but there was no longer any space for misinterpretation. Another pause, then a softer tone. "Are you saying something is wrong?" she asked. I considered the question carefully, not because I needed to think about the answer, but because I understood the weight of how it would be received. "I am saying," I replied, "that I am taking responsibility for my own accounts moving forward." Simple, direct, unmistakable. The line had been drawn, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly enough that it could not be ignored. "Well," she said, her voice now controlled in a different way, less confident, more guarded. "Of course you can do whatever you want. We were just trying to help." I nodded slightly, though she could not see it. "I understand," I said, "and I will take it from here." The call ended shortly after that, without argument, without resolution, but with something far more important established. Position. I set the phone down and remained by the window for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, feeling the steady presence of something that had not been there before. Not tension, not fear. Control. Because for the first time since that afternoon at the table, I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was shaping what would happen next. And as I turned back toward the room, toward the table, toward the life that had not changed on the surface but had shifted entirely beneath it, one thought remained clear, steady, and entirely certain. They had just realized that I was no longer part of their plan, and they had no idea what that meant yet. The house felt quieter that evening, not in the way silence usually settles in, but in a way that made every small sound more noticeable. The ticking clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floor as I moved from one room to another, all of it unchanged, and yet I was aware of it differently, as if I had stepped into a version of my life where nothing could be taken at face value anymore. I did not reach for the folder right away. I let it sit there on the table, closed, steady, a quiet confirmation of everything that no longer needed to be questioned. Instead, I walked through the house slowly, pausing in each room, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this space, this life, had always been mine, shaped by my choices, my discipline, my years of careful planning, and for the first time in a long while, I felt fully present in that ownership again. Around 7 in the evening, my phone rang once more. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. I answered without urgency. "Hello." Daniel's voice came through, more direct this time, less measured than before. "Mom, Ashley said you talked to her this morning." I leaned lightly against the doorway, my gaze resting on the table where the folder remained. "We did," I said. There was no point in avoiding it. She mentioned something about you reviewing your accounts. He continued, his tone carrying a note that had not been there before. Not quite frustration, not quite concern, but something in between. What is going on? I allowed a brief pause, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said next would not need to be repeated. I am taking care of my finances, I replied. That is all. That is all, he echoed, a slight edge entering his voice. Mom, we have been helping you with that. You know that. I remained still, my voice even. Yes, I said. I am aware. There was a shift on the other end, the kind that happens when expectation meets resistance. Then why does it sound like you think something is wrong? He asked. I turned slightly, moving toward the table now, my fingers resting lightly on the surface beside the folder. Because I prefer to understand things clearly, I said. And right now, there are things that require clarification. Silence followed, longer this time, more deliberate. Like what? He asked finally. I looked down at the folder, not opening it, not needing to. Like why there is an account with my name on it that I did not knowingly open, I said calmly. And why it is linked to Ashley. The reaction was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. A pause that stretched just enough to confirm that this was not new information to him. Mom, he said slowly, that is not what it looks like. I did not interrupt. I let him continue. We set that up to help manage things, to make it easier. You said you did not like dealing with all the online stuff, remember? His voice carried a careful reasoning, as if repeating something that had already been discussed before, something that had been accepted without question at the time. I remember being told I was being helped, I said. I do not remember agreeing to share access to my finances without full understanding. Another pause. Shorter, but sharper. We were just trying to make things simpler for you, he insisted. I nodded slightly, though he could not see it. And now I am simplifying them myself, I replied. My tone did not rise. It did not need to. By removing access that I did not authorize. There it was. Clear. Direct. No room for interpretation. You are overreacting, he said, the words coming quicker now, less controlled. There is nothing wrong. Everything has been handled responsibly. I placed my hand gently on the folder, not gripping it, just resting there, grounding the moment in something tangible. That may be how you see it, I said. But it is not how I manage my life. The silence that followed was heavier this time, not uncertain, but resistant. So what are you saying, he asked. That we did something wrong? I considered the question, not because I needed to think about the answer, but because I understood what it represented. This was no longer about explanation. It was about position. I am saying, I replied, my voice steady, that I am correcting something that should not have happened without my full consent. There was a shift then, a subtle break in the rhythm of the conversation, as if the structure they had relied on was no longer holding in the way they expected. We were trying to help you, he repeated, but this time, the certainty was gone. I let that statement settle, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply allowing it to exist without changing my position. Then you will understand why I am taking control of it now, I said. The words were simple, but they carried something that could not be undone. A boundary, a decision, a quiet finality that did not require agreement to be real. Daniel did not respond right away. When he did, his voice was lower, more restrained. I think you are making this into something it is not, he said. I allowed a small breath to pass, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement of the distance that now existed between what was being said and what was true. That is your perspective, I replied. This is mine. Another silence. Then, finally, fine, he said. Do what you think is best. The words sounded like permission, but they were not. They were retreat. We ended the call without further discussion, no raised voices, no dramatic conclusion, just a quiet separation of understanding that no longer needed to be aligned. I set the phone down and remained where I was, my hand still resting lightly on the folder, the house settling around me once again. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same walls, the same furniture, the same quiet evening. But everything beneath it had shifted into something that no longer depended on trust that had been misplaced. I opened the folder then, just enough to see the top page, the numbers, the records, the structure of something that had once been hidden in plain sight. And as I closed it again, one thought remained clear, steady, and entirely resolved. They had believed I depended on them. But the truth was far simpler than that. I had simply allowed them closer than I should have. And now, that distance had been restored.